Good morning, CFC. Blessings to you this January 24th. This morning I would like to talk about the portion in Ephesians chapter 6 that we heard read about taking up the full, putting on the full armor of God, and specifically this morning, taking up the shield of faith, which I'm going to describe also as something that was Jeremiah's habit, even in the midst of his depression. What would it mean to take up the shield of faith when you're feeling blue, when you're feeling discouraged, when you're feeling defeated? The Apostle Paul admonishes the Ephesians, book that probably was written around 30 years after Jesus died, buried, and resurrected. The Apostle Paul admonishes the believer to put on the full armor of God, including what he describes as the shield of faith. By the way, that's a portion worth memorizing, and it might even be, if you're still looking for a Shema, a great one to try to remind ourselves of what God has called us to do as His faithful, shall we say, redemptive, gracious combatants on a world that needs to be restored. And I would ask you, CFC, why a shield of faith? Why not a shield of hope? Remembering that hope is the purpose behind persistence. Take that up. Or a shield of love. Remembering the Beatles told us that all we need is love. In many ways they were right. But as Larry Norman says, then they broke up. After all, the Apostle Paul tells us in his influential and worth memorizing, again, passage, the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, that these three remain, faith, hope, and love. And you know what he describes as the greatest. The greatest is love. So why not a shield of love? Which is one way of describing our covenantal bond. What makes faith, according to Paul, so metaphorically and spiritually superior as a shield to guard against the flaming arrows of the enemy? From the Apostle Paul's armor of God metaphor, the shield of faith is specifically designed to protect the soldier from the the enemy's fiery darts. One needn't feast on scores of YouTube video scenes of satanic horror films to realize the variety of fiendish strategies of our ultimate enemy. The devil's attack mechanisms, the flaming arrows, as Paul calls them, are not only designed to destroy Christ-honoring presence and activity, but to consume whole environments, as fire can do. Fiery darts that easily ignite fires, burning down houses that were once filled with grace. So take up the shield of faith. Sometimes these flaming arrows are the chaotic voices competing with the voice of God, seeking to immobilize us with lies from the pit of hell. Lies that seek to bully and bury us in fear. So we have to take up the shield of faith. So again, why a faith shield? The characteristics of such protective faith acting as a shield are really no different than the faith that governs and guides any interpersonal relationship, whether with a best friend, business partner, or ministerial colleague. Essentially, anyone you have to trust. Friendships and partnerships require interpersonal faith to function, and that faith needs to be protected. For friendships to continue, each participant must have faith in, must trust their friend's ability to essentially keep their promises. And central to our Christian faith is the confidence that God can be trusted to keep his promises. And the promises of God and his Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, CFC, who doesn't lie, who cannot lie, as it says in Titus chapter 1, verse 2, gives us ultimate assurances, providing confidence and spiritual stability in the midst of our battles. Battles that might be in the home or at work or in the culture in general, or the subculture that we know as evangelical Christianity. Again, the promises of God, which will be kept, for God does not lie, give us ultimate assurances, providing confidence and spiritual stability in the midst of our battles. And even the most calm, peaceful person has battles, internally and externally. While experiencing tension and insecurities, sometimes we need, CFC, moment by moment reminders. What am I going to believe? The promises of God or the fiendish threats of the enemies of God's kingdom? Throughout the Bible, God admonishes us to enter battles with courage. But the admonition, take courage, as I've mentioned before in a sermon in the past, is never asserted without his assurances that he is with us. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all of the commands I've given you, for the Lord your God has promised to be with you wherever you go, the Lord said to Joshua, chapter 1, verses 7 through 9. And he says it to us. The shield of faith are those courageous building promises of God that thwart and dismantle the competing threats, the flaming arrows of the devil that can, shall we say, burn down the house. So, practically speaking, CFC, I ask, what might it mean to pick up this shield of faith in our day-to-day spiritual battles? Let me suggest that it's a lot like the description of the prophet Jeremiah, and I've mentioned this to you in the past, the traditionally recognized writer of the Lamentations. Let's just review this again, chapter 3, verses 17 through 23. The prophet was almost immobilized with depression. He describes himself as being deprived of peace and has forgotten any well-being. He was beginning to lose any sense of hope, which means, why go on? Why move on? My promised land is destroyed, and his mind is filled with the depths of his afflictions that overwhelm him and immobilize him and fill him with what he describes as bitterness. And then he notes his soul is downcast. By the way, this is an occupational hazard of the prophetic sensibility. They get exhausted emotionally from their work. And then Jeremiah describes something remarkable in the midst of his despair. He says, yet this I call to mind, and therefore have hope. He decides to reaffirm an overarching truth that ultimately puts his anxieties in an eternal context. What he decides to reaffirm, what he calls to mind, is this. And I am going to suggest what he calls to mind, the calling it to mind is metaphorically parallel to picking up a shield of faith that provides him context, eternal context. He says, "It is because of the Lord's great love that we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness." Jeremiah, nearly knocked out with the anxiety in the midst of the battles within and the battles that seemed all around him, takes up a reassuring truth that gets him up and, shall we say, ready for battle. This act of mental retrieval, calling it to mind, is likened to the act of picking up the shield of faith. The fact is, CFC, whenever we're in a battle, whenever circumstances around us appear to be threatening, we will call something to mind. Are we in the habit of calling to mind the truths of God, the truths of God's eternal provision? Are we taking up the shield of faith? Let me encourage you also to keep practicing and even memorizing your Shema as, in many ways, a contextualizing, shall we say, shield of faith. Blessings on you, and I'll see you next week.